So please join me in welcoming today's guest speaker, Dr. Sara Hamilton from the Oregon Kelp Alliance. Dr. Sara Hamilton is originally from Virginia and received her bachelor's degree in biology and gender studies from Bowdoin College in Maine. She earned her PhD studying kelp forest ecology and conservation under Drs. Kristen Garud-Colvert and Bruce Mengi at Oregon State as a postdoc researcher at the University. Before joining the Oregon Kelp Alliance as the scientific coordinator, she spent 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Davis, studying patterns of hypoxia and acidification across the California current and the implications of these patterns for shellfish species like abalone and Dungeness crabs. In her career, she hopes to use her scientific skills to help manifest equitable and sustainable ocean resource use. And today she's going to talk to us a little bit about Oregon's kelp. And with that, please welcome Dr. Sara Hamilton.
Thanks, Yicheng. Hey, great. Thanks for having me here today, folks. Yicheng, thanks for inviting me to come down. Yeah, my name is Sara Hamilton. Today I'm here representing the Oregon Kelp Alliance. I am the scientific coordinator. I'll be talking about Oregon's kelp forests, their past, present, and future. I was going to go into a little spiel about who I am, but Yicheng did that well for me. So thank you, Yicheng. So I'll just go ahead and hop on in about what we're going to be talking about today. We just practiced this. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to start off by doing some Kelp Forest 101, just talk a little bit about some of the basics of kelp forest so we all have some of the basic terminology. Then I'll kind of zoom way out and talk about kelp as a global ecosystem across the entire world. I'll zoom back into Oregon specifically to kind of talk about the Oregon context and focus on the past and the present of kelp forests in Oregon. And then we're going to pivot to talk about what the future of kelp forests in Oregon could look like. And that's when I'm going to talk a little bit more about the organization I work for, the Oregon Kelp Alliance. I'll end with a couple of parting messages to take home to your family and your friends. And then we should have hopefully 15, 20 minutes for question and answer. So let's dive on in. Okay, so just to start, what the heck is a kelp anyway? So a kelp is actually a large brown marine seaweed. Seaweeds are different from plants, but they photosynthesize the way that plants do. Kelps like to live in cool, shallow waters, and they actually line about 1/4 of the world's coastlines. An important set of terms to know that you'll hear me talking about are canopy and subcanopy kelps. And so just like trees create a forest, kelps create a kelp forest. And just like trees have canopy forming species like big Doug firs that reach up to the top of the forest and create the canopy, kelps have canopy forming species as well. So these are the species of kelp that reach all the way up to the surface of the water. And you can see them as you drive down 101. You can see stretches of kelp forests that kind of float up to the surface and are distributed there. But additionally, just like forests have shrubs or smaller trees like vine maples, kelps can also grow in subcanopy varieties that don't get all the way up to the surface. So you can't see them through drone imagery or driving down 101, but they still there's a lot of diversity in these subcanopy kelps, and they can create a lot of very rich habitat, even in the absence of canopy kelps. So why are kelp forests so exciting? What is it about them that we should all care about? So as I, kind of going with this forest metaphor, kelps are foundation species that create entire ecosystems that are rich and biodiverse and benefit both animal communities and human communities. So I'll go through some of the ecosystem services or these different benefits, these things that kelps do that's so awesome. So to kind of start, as a foundation species, they found this ecosystem by supporting habitat for a lot of other species. So when you get kelp forests growing in the near shore, lots of little bitty things like to come and hide in amongst their fronds. And then you get bigger things like small fishes coming to graze on those little tiny zooplankton and shrimps and mysids. And then you get bigger things like black rockfish or maybe seals that are coming in to eat those smaller fish. And so it just cascades up. And so kind of fundamentally, one of the first things that kelp forests do is they create a lot of habitat that attracts a biodiversity of species. Additionally, kelp itself is a food for many species in the ocean, as well as humans. Critters that depend really heavily on kelp include urchins, abalone. You can see a couple of snails in this picture I took. There are certain kinds of fish that will graze on kelp. And human cultures across the globe for centuries, for millennia, have been eating kelp as well. So as a function of being habitat and food for this rich biodiversity of species, kelp forests end up supporting a lot of major fisheries all along the US West Coast. And so that includes fisheries for abalone, urchins, lots of different kinds of rockfish, cabezon. And so they support fisheries not only by providing habitat for adult species, but kelp forests are also important habitat for juvenile species. So particularly rockfish. Rockfish are one of the foundations of our commercial and recreational fishing here in Oregon. And juvenile rockfish, as well as juvenile salmon, really utilize kelp forests as something we call nursery habitat. The juveniles like to live there. So they support a number of diverse fisheries for both shellfish and fish. Additionally, when I talk to my friends about, I work with kelp, they're always like, oh, I saw an article about how growing kelp is the new thing, right? It's like supposed to be a superfood, a super industry. And indeed, kelp aquaculture has exploded in the last 5 to 10 years or so. And one of the reasons why is that it's such a low impact species to culture, because you don't have to add anything to kelp forest cultures the way you do with like salmon farms or things like that. All they really need is nutrient-rich waters and to be somewhere with a lot of light, and they can grow incredibly quickly and either be used directly for humans to be used for humans to eat, be used in all sorts of different industrial processes, or they can also be combined with other kinds of aquaculture. For instance, they're oftentimes fed to aquaculture to abalone. Additionally, on a slightly more whimsical note, they're just incredible places to spend time. And so they end up attracting lots of different forms of recreation and tourism. That's actually a picture of my fiance snorkeling with me in a kelp forest. Snorkeling, diving, kayaking, spearfishing, all sorts of different things. People just enjoy spending time and will spend a lot of money and energy to go and be in these kelp forests. And then finally, they also have a number of benefits in terms of climate resilience. And so there are a couple different ways that kelp forests can contribute to the climate resilience of our oceans in general. And so one of those ways is that kelps are actually pretty in localized conditions within a kelp forest. They can mitigate the impacts of ocean acidification and hypoxia, which are important and big problems here on the Oregon coast. They often grow right along the shoreline, and they take a beating from the waves, so they can actually buffer the coastline from wave energy, which becomes increasingly important as coastal erosion increases from stormier seas and sea level rise. They also are incredibly effective, efficient photosynthesizers, and they can suck down massive amounts of carbon, cycle that carbon through our coastal ecosystems, and a fraction of that carbon will end up getting sequestered in the deep ocean. So all around, kelp forests are these incredible ecosystems that support diverse animal communities and also support coastal human communities. So let's zoom out to kind of think about these incredible ecosystems on a global scale. So I mentioned earlier that they cover about 1/4 of the world's coastlines. Sometimes people think of kelp forests as kind of niche or specialized ecosystems, but they're actually incredibly broadly distributed. You'll find them primarily in temperate and polar regions. They fundamentally like cool waters, so you'll notice across the tropics, they're mostly absent. And when you go all around the world and you calculate about, you look across about 1/4 of the world's coastlines and you look at all the ecosystem services and benefits and fishery support that they provide in all these different places, it's been estimated that kelp forests globally are worth about $500 billion annually. So these are incredibly widely distributed, highly valuable ecosystems spread out over a lot of area. Additionally, on the global scale, in the last 10 or 15 years, kelp forests all over the world are facing increasing threats. And we see kelp forests declining in a number of different parts of the world. These are some of the yellow splotches you can see are just some of the places that I know from reading the literature off the top of my head, places where you've seen incredible declines or even collapses of kelp forest ecosystem. And some of the drivers that are contributing to global threats to kelp forests include ocean warming. I mentioned that they're just kind of fundamentally cool water species. So in places where the water is warming very quickly, like Tasmania and Australia, that can wipe out hundreds of miles of kelp forests. Pollution, particularly nutrient runoff and other forms of pollution, especially along urbanized coastlines, can cause kelp forest declines. Invasive species, whether those are invasive seaweed species or invasive urchins or other parts of the ecosystem. And then finally, one that you may be more familiar with, urchin overgrazing, or in some other parts of the world, it's not necessarily urchins, it may be snails, but herbivore overgrazing is another one of these big threats that we see contributing to global declines of kelp forests. And I want to point out one that's particularly important for our story here today, which if you look at that little splotch that is over Northern California, in 2014 through about 2016, during the warm water event known as the blob, Northern California suffered an incredible collapse of the kelp forest ecosystems, where within just a couple of years, about 90 to 95% of their bull kelp canopy, so one of their big canopy forming species, was kind of just gone. It had incredible impacts on Northern California, both the ecosystems there, but also tourism and recreation. The abalone fisheries, the urchin fisheries had to be closed down. Tourism has declines in the region, and it obviously has a host of other impacts on the animals that depend on these kelp forests. And so one of the most troubling things about this is that happened about around 2015, 2016, and we haven't really seen them coming back. You know, you've seen small increases here or there, depending on whether it's an El Nino or a La Nina year. But overall, we're just not seeing the system bounce back the way that kelp forests can do sometimes, because they're incredibly dynamic systems. And that's incredibly concerning. Then there are a lot of groups in Northern California working to try to reverse this and do something about it. And so what does that all mean for us here in Oregon? Let's zoom in from that global context back down to Oregon and introduce you a little bit to Oregon's kelp forests. So in Oregon's kelp forests, we have our primary iconic canopy forming species is the bull kelp. You can see it over there on the left. They're pretty incredible. They anchor onto the substrate. They have this long stipe that goes up to the surface. That stipe is held up there by a bladder, an air-filled bladder. And then they have this burst of fronds that come off of that and are held up next to the surface where they can get access to a lot of light. Their scientific name, Nereocystis leucana, is actually derived from Greek words that loosely translated mean a mermaid's bladder, referring to that air-filled bladder. So that's our iconic canopy forming species, but we also here in Oregon and in this part of the Pacific Ocean in general, we have one of the highest diversity of subcanopy species in the world, really high diversity of kelps. And so there's a variety of subcanopy species that comprise our kelp forests as well. We have things like broad-ribbed kelp, old-growth kelp, all growing under slightly different conditions with slightly different life histories and population dynamics. So those are the species that comprise our kelp forests, but where would you find kelp forests here in Oregon? So one thing to know about kelps is that they can only grow on rocky substrate. Kelps are not like plants in that plants put down roots into the soil. Kelps don't have roots. They have to anchor themselves onto a rock or a boulder or some sort of rocky substrate. And that means you're only going to find them in places that have that rocky substrate here in Oregon. And so along the north and central coast, we get smaller patch forests around places like Pacific City, Cape Lookout, Depot Bay, and Newport. But then when you get from about Cape Arago southwards, that's where the real prime kelp forest habitat is. And instead of seeing kind of occasional patch forests, you'll see much more continuously distributed kelp forests lining the south coast from Cape Arago down to Brookings. But the last 150 years have been hard on Oregon's kelp forests. What are some of the things that have changed in the last 150 years for these ecosystems in Oregon? So in the late 1800s, otters were driven extinct by the Hudson Bay Fur Company. Starting in the 1860s onward, American colonists began displacing diverse indigenous peoples as those colonists settled and developed the Oregon coast, displacing traditional management regimes. From about the 2000s onward, we've begun to see increasing impacts of global climate change, whether that be volatile upwelling regimes, marine heat waves, ocean warming. From about 2014 through 2016, the Oregon coast, some of you may be aware, was hit by sea star wasting disease, which decimated all sorts of sea star species up and down the coast, but it was particularly hard hit on the sunflower sea star, which is another urchin-eating predator along with otters. And those sunflower sea stars declined by about 90%, 99% here in Oregon. And we only in the past year or so have begun to see some little ones popping up here and there. So we lost another one of those major predators. And then by 2019, one of the things that kind of catalyzed the beginning of the Oregon Kelp Alliance was that red urchin divers on the South Coast had to stop fishing Orford Reef, which is one of the biggest reefs in all of Oregon. It's down by Port Orford, and it's actually, the reef itself is much bigger than the city of Port Orford, which is pretty cool. And that traditionally was some of the richest urchin diving grounds, and those divers had to stop fishing Orford Reef and go elsewhere because the kelp had been overeaten by this overpopulation of urchins. And you would think, well, they're urchin divers. Isn't an overpopulation of urchins a good thing? Unfortunately, they ate down all the kelp, and so then they didn't have any more food resources, and they began starving. And so they were low quality urchins that couldn't be sent on to sushi and other markets. So that's kind of the past things that have been impacting Oregon's kelp forests. How have our kelp forests responded to this? Well, one of the things is that scuba diving and other forms of monitoring kelp forests have historically been pretty difficult to do here in Oregon. Oregon's not a very friendly place for divers. And then some of these changes started, back in the late 1800s when people weren't monitoring kelp forests. And so there's a lot of data limitations. There's really patchy data that we can look to try to understand how these forests are changing. So we're lucky enough that we have another tool that we can use to understand how our kelp forests are changing, which is actually the satellite record. So there have been satellites that have been going around the planet since the 1980s, taking pictures of the surface of the planet. And kelp forests can be big enough, and those canopy-forming kelps, because they're along the surface of the water, can actually be seen from space in these satellite pictures. So if you go and you look over since about the 1984, yeah, those show up good. Since about 1984, you can look in these satellite images, and they're not perfect. There's uncertainty in the record, but it begins to give us one of the best ideas we have of how these kelp forests have changed over time. And so there's a really interesting picture emerging here. So let's see, there's the laser. I'm not sure if everyone's able to see it, but across the x-axis for all of these graphs is a time series running from 1984 up through 2020. Along the y-axis, it's representing total canopy area. So in a given year, just how big did the canopy get? Just what was the footprint of that bull kelp forest? And we have it for 4 of the larger kelp forests in Oregon historically: Cape Arago, Orford Reef, Redfish Rocks, and Rogue Reef. And something that's kind of interesting is that each one tells a little bit of a different story. So if you start a little more north and look at Cape Arago, you can kind of see, one thing to note, you'll see this rapid up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down in the satellite record. And what that is that bull kelp are annual species, kind of like annuals in your garden. And so they start out the year as little baby tiny kelps that haven't reached the surface yet. And it's not until about July that they hit the surface and they become, you can see them in satellite records. So their annual life cycle is what's causing that up, down, up, down. So that part is normal. And so what you see at Cape Arago is actually like a pretty normal, happy kelp forest. Maybe if you looked at it long enough and kind of squinted your eyes, you might see a trend one way or the other. But in general, kelp forests at Cape Arago have kind of just been pittering along for the last 30 plus years, not really gaining in size, not decreasing in size, just kind of living their life. When you move down to the Port Orford area, though, is when we begin to see some of these really unsettling decreases. So the second graph here is from Orford Reef. You can see how big it is on this image here. And what you can see is that from their peaks in the late 80s and early 90s, kelp forests down at Orford Reef now are a mere fraction of what they used to be. And it's been that way, especially since about 2018 or so. You see a similar picture at Redfish Rocks, which is just south of Port Orford. Maybe not as severe as Orford Reef, but still a noticeable decline since the 1980s. And then you get down here to Gold Beach, and Rogue Reef, since about 2000, has only been increasing in size. Almost every year, it's done a little bit better. So Rogue Reef has been highlighted as kind of like this hope spot or this like surprising good news story. So what is going on here? How do we make sense of all these different patterns? And so essentially, we are seeing some areas with really serious declines, but it's patchy. It depends where you are and what's going on locally with the kelp forest. And that's good news, because that means we don't have what Northern California had. Northern California had, across a couple hundred miles of coastline, a synchronized collapse of their bull kelp forests. What we have here is much patchier, which is good news, because it means, that there's a lot less work to smaller areas to be restored and taken care of and protected. I also, since we're here in Newport, I've been focusing mostly on the South Coast, but we're here in Newport. So I wanted to give a shout out to some of the most significant kelp forests in the north or central part of the coast, which historically were around Depot Bay. And so these maps aren't my best maps I've ever made, but what you see over here in this image is all those green splotches are places in the satellite record where there used to be pretty extensive kelp forests going from about Otter Rock Marine Reserve up to just north of Depot Bay. And these kelp forests, if you look at the satellite record, it's a little patchier for the Depot Bay area. Sometimes the satellites can't get good images for various reasons. But you see something a bit troubling, which is that in the past, in the 80s and the 90s, you saw these really big, good years. And then ever since about 2015, so the past 15, 20 years, they've been at really low depressed levels. You're not seeing any of those occasional big spikes up to really good years. So that's, I would label kind of Depot Bay as another one of those areas where we're concerned about the kelp forest and we don't think they're doing very well. So some of you in the audience may be thinking to yourselves, well, why are you seeing these patchy declines? Why wouldn't it be the same everywhere or more synchronous? We're not sure exactly. Some of the things that have contributed to kelp forest decline in Northern California that are probably at work here in Oregon include marine heat waves and warming waters, which again are challenging for kelps because they like cool waters. Climate change is also changing all of the physical and chemical properties of our ocean, and those can impact kelps in a variety of ways. So for instance, increasingly stormy seas, big storms with big waves tend to rip kelp out, make it harder for it to persist. So increasingly stormy seas could have a negative impact on kelp forests. Additionally, changes in the fundamental chemistry of our waters could mean that kelps aren't getting as much nutrients as they need to grow really well. So there could be more subtle aspects of climate change that aren't related to temperature driving some of these declines. There hasn't been historically a lot of research on kelp forests in Oregon, so I'm fully aware that there could be unidentified factors that we haven't even really considered or looked at yet, things like pollution or subtle effects that are coming from elsewhere. But one thing that we know for sure is driving some of the declines at some of these reefs is a loss of top predators that has allowed these urchin populations to just blossom. So let's talk a little bit about urchin overpopulation. So I kind of mentioned these urchin barrens we're seeing expanding. We definitely see them at Orford Reef. We see them at Redfish Rocks. We've seen them in parts of Depot Bay. And so you would think all these urchins come and they graze down all the kelp, and then there's no kelp. So they die and they go away, and then the kelp forest can regenerate, right? Wrong. Turns out urchins are incredible little creatures that don't need food to survive for long periods of time, which is the bane of my existence at this point in my life. But so they do this thing that's this phenomenon known as zombie urchins, which is that once they've grazed down all the kelp, they ramp down their metabolism and they can essentially hibernate for long periods of time. There's actually a journal article I saw where somebody took an urchin and they put it in a tank and it had flowed through seawater, but they didn't feed it anything for 16 months. And they came back and it was still kicking. It wasn't living its best life. Its metabolism was ramped down real low, but it was still alive. And so just because the kelp, they're one of their main, most preferred food sources is gone, doesn't mean these urchins leave. And it's, as I mentioned, it's known as zombie urchins. So it's incredibly interesting biologically, but it's a big problem because these places where we've seen these urchin barrens existing, they're not likely to go away anytime soon. And so what does that, that's kind of the past and the present condition of Oregon's kelp forest. But what does that mean about the future? What can we expect to see 50, 100, 200 years from now? And so that's where the organization that I work for comes in. I work for the Oregon Kelp Alliance, which works for healthy kelp forests. We often refer to it as ORCA, so that we can draw in the people who like marine mammals and then, gotcha, it's actually about kelp. So ORCA members, we're an alliance. We work with lots of different groups, and ORCA members have diverse interests in kelp forest ecosystems, including urchin divers, tribal members, researchers, managers, conservationists, tour guides, sports divers, and even chefs are members of the Oregon Kelp Alliance. We're a relatively new organization. We started in about 2020. We're based out of Port Orford, where some of the state's biggest and most beautiful kelp forests are based, but we work statewide. And so what is ORCA doing to create a future where Oregon's kelp forests can thrive? So I'll go through a couple of different things ORCA is doing. The first one is documenting kelp forest status. So a year or two ago, Senator Jeff Merkley helped ORCA gain access to funds so that we could create an Oregon kelp forest status report and a kelp forest recovery plan. And so for the status report, what we're doing, we need to understand, since these declines are so patchy, we need to understand where kelp forests doing well, where are they struggling, so that we can send resources for restoration to the places that need it the most. And so we're doing that this year by funding a big push of monitoring work across the whole coast to get a snapshot of how our kelp forests are doing, both from above and down below. How are they doing in 2023? And so we're deploying a lot of scuba divers to go check out the subcanopy kelps and the urchins and the abalones living underneath. And then we also use satellite data and drones to monitor canopy area from above, particularly in areas where it's hard to get divers. So that's the first, we're collecting that data for 2023, but we're also working with partners who have been taking kelp forest data in the past. So we're working a lot with ODF and W. We're working with historical satellite data sets. We're working with even a survey that was done in 1912 of kelp forest area in the state. And so we want to gather information on historically, what did our kelp forests look like? What do they look like today? And what does that tell us about where it's really in trouble? And so we'll be in June 2024, so this time next year, ORCA will be publishing an ORCA kelp forest status report. And then we'll also be publishing a kelp forest recovery plan, 2 separate documents. The first one is to document what's going on, and the second one is to, based on the literature, based on experts in Oregon's kelp forests, identify what are our best tools for recovering, restoring, and protecting these kelp forests into the future. I also note that all the data that we're collecting this year in 2024 will go up on the West Coast Ocean Data Portal. So it will be accessible for folks in this room to use if you're interested. So that's the first thing. We're documenting kelp forest status, but documenting the problem doesn't necessarily change it. So the second thing that we're doing is coordinating and funding kelp forest restoration. We have a 3-pronged strategy for kelp forest restoration. We want to use a couple different strategies to maximize our chances of success. The first one is grazer removal. So that's primarily going in and getting rid of some of these urchins that are creating these urchin-bearing conditions and preventing kelp from reestablishing. And that's something that's in progress. We're working with both recreational divers and commercial urchin divers to go into a few targeted sites that have been identified by ORCA contributors as really important kelp forests. And we're sending divers in to remove some of those urchins. So that's in progress. The second prong is kelp enhancement. So just because you clear the urchins out doesn't mean that kelp forests automatically reestablish on that substrate. And so we want to maximize the chances of that happening in places where we remove urchins by doing kelp enhancement, which is essentially different ways of seeding or planting little tiny baby kelps out there. There are a couple different ways you can do this, things like spore bags, where you kind of increase the seed supply, things like green gravel, where you culture a bunch of little tiny baby kelps in the lab and get them out onto those reefs after the urchins have been cleared. So that's not one we're doing right now. That's funding and funding dependent. We are writing a lot of grants this year to try to be able to do that in coming years. And then the third prong of one thing to say about these first two prongs is that they don't work on big spatial scales. They work on small spatial scales. They take a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money. So we can't do them across the whole state. We can only do them in places that are where kelp forests are struggling, and those kelp forests are particularly important to people or fisheries or some other sector. And so they're small scale targeted interventions. However, the third prong that we're supporting is predator recovery, which can take place at a much larger spatial scale by restoring kind of ecosystem balance across the state. And so traditionally, I've kind of mentioned there were two major urchin-eating predators in Oregon. Sea otters, which were extirpated in the late 1800s. There's a wonderful organization called the Alaka Alliance that is pushing for organizing for sea otter reintroduction here in Oregon. So the Alaka Alliance is focusing a lot of their efforts on otters. And so Orca decided that we were going to focus on that other predator that doesn't get as much attention, which are sunflower sea stars. And that's something I kind of mentioned, we're just now, about 10 years after their populations crashed in Oregon, beginning to see a couple little babies here, one bigger guy that comes up in a fisherman's long line there. And so we're working with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, we're working with the Oregon Coast Aquarium to think about, can we either start a captive breeding program to breed these up, breed a bunch of sunflower sea stars in an aquarium and then deploy them to some of these struggling kelp forests? Or can we translocate ones that are already out there into some of these restoration sites? So that's something that's ongoing, although all of this is funding dependent. And if you'll allow me for just a second, I want to go on a bit of a sidebar because sunflower sea stars are near and dear to my heart. And I think they're one of the coolest predators that you've never heard of before. So sunflower sea stars, you can see from some of these pictures, they, instead of what we normally think of with sea stars, they actually have 25 arms instead of having just 5 or 6, like a lot of sea stars. Additionally, they're one of the biggest sea star species in the entire world, and they can grow to be about 3 feet across, a full meter. So they're big. They're also voracious predators. They can eat urchins, clams, mussels, all sorts of different things. They're kind of generalists in their food patterns. They'll eat a lot of things that are available. Additionally, they can, when they're in kelp forests, a lot of times they specialize on urchins, and they can cause these things that are known as urchin stampedes. And so this isn't the best picture in the world. I took it from a video, so I apologize for the quality. But this is a picture from a video taken by Grant Downey, who's an urchin diver in Northern California. He had his GoPro with him as he was on a dive, and he was in an urchin barren. You can see just how many urchins line some of these barrens. And what you can kind of see, it's a little grainy right there, but there's a sunflower sea star. And you see the sunflower sea star's arms kind of flicking back as it reaches out to touch the urchins. It's much better in the video. But you can see the urchins are forming this front as they move away, and they kind of end up stumbling over one another and falling backwards as they try to get out of the way of the sunflower sea star. So it's known locally as urchin stampedes. And it's one thing that's really exciting about sunflower sea stars is that it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that we've begun to really understand the importance that they can play to kelp forest. It was really only once we lost them due to sea star wasting disease that people started noticing, whoa, where did all these urchins come from? We never used to have urchins like this. And over the last 5 to 10 years, researchers from Southern California to Alaska have been documenting the role that these predators can play in eating or scaring enough urchins away from kelp forests to let the kelp forest stay happy and healthy. And that includes scientists that are members of ORCA, scientists at Oregon State and University of Oregon that have been developing that body of knowledge about this kind of predator role sea stars can play that's kind of analogous to what sea otters do. And as I mentioned, we lost about 99% of them in Oregon around 2014 through 2016 to sea star wasting disease. So that's my sidebar on sunflower sea stars because they are near and dear to my heart. Thank you for your patience. So getting back to my description of what ORCA is doing for the future of kelp forests here in Oregon, the first thing I talked about was documenting kelp forest status. The second was coordinating and funding kelp forest restoration. And the third one I want to talk about is treating kelp forests as a socio-ecological system. So one thing that I really love about the work that ORCA does is that we care desperately about these ecosystems and the animals that live in them. But I also love getting to work in an organization that understands just how deeply Oregon's coastal communities are intertwined with the health and the sustainability of our ecosystems, and is able to think of not just about the sustainability of kelp forests, but also the sustainability of our coastal communities, particularly as these oftentimes very natural resource dependent communities are struggling to adapt to all the curveballs that climate change is throwing at them. And so we do a lot of different things that think about how can kelp forests be part of a flourishing, vibrant coastal economy and coastal knowledge base. And so I'll just highlight a few of the things that we do. We have projects working on how can you take urchins from these urchin barrens, little purple urchins, and remember I said they're starving when they're in urchin barrens, so they can't be sold on the uni market. But you can work with people who culture dulse here in Oregon. Dulse is a kind of seaweed. And you can, early experiments, I found that you can fatten up these urchins within, I think about 2 months was one of the sweet spots by feeding them dulse. And then they're fat and happy and available to be sold for a much higher price on the uni market. So thinking about, the little bit of, can we take some of these urchins away from kelp forests and benefit, plug them into new sources of aquaculture along the coast. Additionally, we do a lot of education. When I first came here in 2017, and I would tell people I was studying kelp forests, they seemed really confused as to what a kelp forest was, that we had it here in Oregon. So there's a lot of groundwork to be done, just kind of letting people know that these exist, talking about what are some of their drivers, why are they important. Additionally, we recognize that one of the greatest resources for supporting the sustainability and good management of Oregon's kelp forests into the future are the tribes of Oregon's coast. And so one of the ways we try to support tribal sovereignty is we work, we're in the midst of building relationships with a variety of natural resource managers at 4 or 5 different tribes along the Oregon and Northern California coast. But this year, we're also bringing natural resource managers and teenagers from the Tolowa Dene Nation in Northern California and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians down to Port Orford. We want to get them out on the water so that they can go explore their ancestral waters and see the kelp forests and get to experience them. So it's they get to re-experience those ecosystems that they've oftentimes lost access to. And then finally, also thinking a little bit about workforce development. So how do we get people, volunteering for a good cause is one thing, but we want people to get paid for caring about kelp forests and doing mariculture, doing education, supporting tribal sovereignty. So one of the things we're trying to find funding for right now is an extension of a program that Reef Check, who is one of our partners, they're a community science program. Reef Check in other places has a dive into science program that basically funds people that generally wouldn't get a chance to learn how to dive, funds them with equipment and training and trains them up to a level that they can then become kelp forest stewards and have this set of skills that allow them to engage more in marine biology and underwater construction and mariculture and all of these different things. So that is some of the work we've been doing on the socio-ecological front. So I want to leave time for plenty of questions. So I'll go ahead and begin to wrap up with a few parting messages that you can all take home to your friends and families now when they ask you, what did you do this afternoon? You can say, did you know that kelp forests support incredible biodiversity as well as coastal communities? You can also tell them that number 2, between the loss of urchin-eating predators and climate change, Oregon is losing some of its kelp forests, not all of them. We're not nearly as bad off as Northern California, but we need to act now so that we don't become as bad as Northern California. And then number 3, you can tell your friends and family that if we Oregonians, not just Orca, but Oregonians as a whole, help to take care of our kelp forests, then they're going to be in better shape to be able to persist through climate change and all the curveballs that climate change is throwing kelp forests. They'll also be able to better persist and continue supporting our coastal communities as they also deal with those same curveballs climate change is bringing. So as I wrap up here today, I just want to acknowledge I'm here representing the Oregon Kelp Alliance, but we are an alliance and we have so many amazing partner organizations that help make Orca what it is. These are not even all of them. A few that I'll point out specifically that have been particularly important supporters include the Ocean Foundation out of Washington, D.C., Oregon Sea Grant, the Port of Port Orford, South Coast Tours, and then Oregon State University's Port Orford Field Station. So particular shout out to you students. If you like doing research here in Hatfield, you could also do it down on the South Coast on kelp forests at the Port Orford Field Station. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. If you're interested in learning more about the Oregon Kelp Alliance, you can visit us at oregonkelp.com and sign up for our quarterly newsletter. Well, you'll get lots of updates on what we're doing and community events you can come to. You can also follow us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Yeah, and so that's it. And I just want to thank everyone for their time and their presence and their energy, and happy to take questions now.
Questions? Yes.
It's hard to imagine that climate change doesn't affect the kelp forests, but do you know the mechanisms or how this is happening, or is this an association that you see, or what do you think? How does that happen?
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting about the situation in Oregon is that globally, the biggest piece of climate change that is threatening to kelp are the heat waves and the warming waters, so temperature increase. And we've seen in lots of different places like Tasmania and parts of British Columbia, particularly inland waters, as those heat up, the kelp forests die back. One of the things that's really crazy about Oregon is if you actually go and look at our near shore temperature records over the last 20 or 30 years, we are seeing increased heat waves, but the waters aren't actually necessarily getting that much warmer. And it's partially because of we live in this upwelling ecosystem that during the summer, when the water should be warmest, upwelling is delivering cold, nutrient-rich waters to the coast. And so we're not actually warming in the same way that like Southern California or Tasmania or the inland waters of British Columbia are. And so I feel, you know, in other places, I think the mechanisms behind how kelp forests are responding to climate change are much stronger. It's usually temperature related, either long-term slow warming or marine heat waves. Sometimes it's related to stormy seas. But here in Oregon, I'm kind of gesturing vaguely at climate change because it's changing the system, but I don't think we really know how it's changing the system in a way that matters to kelp right now. Because in every other place, we're only tracking temperature, and that doesn't quite seem to be the key to the puzzle that we would expect here in Oregon.
I'm working on something that's collapsing all up and down the coast, and it's not collapsing as fast in Oregon.
Sorry, say that again.
I work in estuaries, but in the estuaries, the changes, they're very dramatic, but they're not as dramatic in Oregon.
Yeah, estuaries I've done a little bit of work in estuaries, and hats off to you. They're so complex. There's so many things going on. They're really hard to understand. So yeah, that's interesting to hear about estuaries as well.
Sara, nice job summarizing all of this great information about our, our bull kelp and the subcanopies. I'm going to build on the estuary thing. 2 weeks ago in Tillamook Bay on a flood tide, we encountered and photographed a big mass of macrocystis, about the size of 2 couches, washing in there.
Cool.
So my question is, where do you think that came from? And why is macrocystis so rare here in Oregon?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question, Steve. So for folks, macrocystis is giant kelp. Giant kelp is the species that's primarily, if you see big kelp forests down in California, those are primarily giant kelp. like 99% of Oregon's kelp forests, canopy forests are bull kelp, Nereocystis, but we do have a couple patches of macrocystis, giant kelp, particularly down around Cape Arago. There's a pretty consistent patch there. And I've thought the same thing for years, Steve, because the only patch that we really know of in Oregon is down in Cape Arago, and yet people see them in Tillamook, people see it wash up on the beach in Newport. And so I don't think we really know yet whether there are other patches elsewhere. Oregon's coastline, especially like our kelp forests are still pretty, we're still learning lots of new things about them. They still continue to surprise us. So there could be other patches of macrocystis in different places. So that's interesting to hear there was so much in Tillamook, because it is a little hard to imagine that much of it drifting all the way from Cape Arago, although the ocean is an insane place. So but thank you for that question about why do we have bull kelp and not macrocystis here? One of the main differences between these two species, bull kelp is an annual species, whereas giant kelp is perennial, tends to live about 3 to 7 years in California. And one of the things that we think is going on here in Oregon is that waves are really tough on giant kelp because they live for multiple years. And so if a big wavy storm event comes through and rips out a bunch of giant kelp, it's kind of, that ends its life cycle there. Whereas bull kelps as annual species have actually kind of adapted to the fact that we get these slamming storms in the winter. And so their life cycle kind of takes advantage of the fact that, okay, we'll grow as big as we can grow by the end of summer. We kind of expect to get ripped out during these fall and winter storm events. And that's okay, that's normal, because we are going to start again next year with little baby kelps anyway. So I think probably one of the best hypotheses as to why we have so much bull kelp here in Oregon has to do with it's just so dang wave exposed. Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Any questions online?
We have one question from Gail Hansen. They're asking, are there subcanopy kelp species here that the urchins will not eat? And also, are they still in the barren grounds?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the subcanopy species that urchins don't like as much are, I'm sorry, I don't know the common name, but the scientific name is desmarestia. They're a small, a lot of times kind of stringier or like thinner kelp. And they just are armed with a lot of chemical compounds that just aren't tasty. So the urchins don't really like eating them. I know when I've dove in like the Otter Rock area with the marine reserves, I see a good bit of desmarestia, and there is a lot of, that is one of the places where we see these urchin barrens expanding. However, I've dove on other urchin barrens where you don't see any at all. So I think that, that a question like that is going to require the kind of data that we and other groups are collecting this year, all that subtitle data around where do you see what kind of algae species and how are they associated with what densities of urchins and things like that. So I think that's probably a good hypothesis. I don't think it occurs everywhere. And like I said, so many more things to learn and be surprised about by Oregon's kelp forests. So maybe that'll come forward in future years.
First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is, I know you mentioned how sunflower sea stars have declined by like 99%. And I know you mentioned how one of Orca's goals is to reestablish them. And I was curious if since that event in 2014, if there's been any recovery.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the interesting things that happened with sea star wasting disease was that, so sunflower sea stars range from about Baja California all the way up to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And we saw this spatial story where on the outer coast of Washington, Oregon, California, and Baja, sunflower sea stars were wiped out by like 99%. However, when you get into the Puget Sound, when you get into chunks of British Columbia, Alaska, they were hit hard there too, but it was only like they declined by 80%. So you still get these remnant populations, and sometimes these strong remnant populations of a number of big adults that you can find in places like British Columbia and Alaska. So far, the data that we have, when I last checked it in 2022, hadn't shown any signs of recovery anywhere. However, Alaska and British Columbia, there's a lot of water up there, and it's very irregularly monitored. So I think it could well be happening in a lot of those places. One thing to be wary of, or one thing that I'm concerned about, is that in a number of places in British Columbia, in Puget Sound, for years now, we've seen little baby sunflower sea stars, and everyone's like, yes, they're coming back, they're rebounding. And you never see those babies grow into bigger adults. And we're not sure if they're dying before they reach to adulthood. We're not sure if they migrate somewhere else as adults, like maybe deeper down, so you can't see them as easily. So I'm really heartened to hear that we've had a number of sightings of some of the juvenile sunflower stars in Oregon recently. But I am worried that we're going to see a pattern kind of emerge similar to that at some other places where we see the juveniles, but we just don't see the adult populations rebounding. So overall, thus far, we have not seen evidence of strong recovery anywhere across their range, which is different than other stars, like, for instance, the ochre star, which has rebounded in a real way here in Oregon. You can go out in the tide pools and see them now. So other sea stars have rebounded. We aren't seeing a lot of evidence for that with sunflower sea stars yet, unfortunately, which is one of the reasons we feel like there needs to be real, meaningful conservation action to protect the species before it kind of falls off a extinction cliff. Yeah.
Any questions online?
Hi, my question was about the urchin population and kind of pulling those back. Do you know what the kind of amount you need to take away of urchins to kind of ensure that when you put in new kelp and kind of restore them, what is the amount of urchins that you need to remove to ensure that that is going to be a healthier ecosystem once it starts growing?
Yeah, so there's this kind of interesting dynamic that emerges, which is that in a normal healthy kelp forest, there are plenty of urchins. You know, you see urchins all the time, and it's I can talk, don't get me started on urchins, it won't stop anytime soon, but you can see relatively high densities and it's okay. They're not overgrazing the kelp. However, going the opposite way, restoring a kelp forest, what has been found is that you need to get it down to basically zero. There really can't be very many urchins around, because as soon as these little baby kelps begin to try to establish and reestablish that kelp forest, these hungry, starved urchins make a beeline and will just eat down all the kelps that are trying to reestablish. And so that's one of the reasons it's not a strategy for big spatial scales, because you have to do it so thoroughly. You have to do it really well. You have to go in and clear out. And there's a cove down by Port Orford, Nellie's Cove, that we've been working for a couple of years. We've been using volunteer recreational divers to try to do urchin cullings. And one summer we did all these weekends with hundreds of volunteers and dive hours and all this work, and we removed 42,000 urchins from this cove. And it was probably like an eighth of the cove. There were probably like 200,000 urchins that needed to be removed. So that's one of the reasons that now the plan that we want to use moving forward is to pivot to using commercial urchin divers who are really comfortable underwater. They're really good at grabbing urchins. They can pay those folks to go in and do the initial, vacuuming up, the full clearing out, and then work with volunteer divers who aren't quite as effective, can only come on the weekends, things like that. You work with them to maintain that urchin-free zone as little urchins begin to scurry back in, go pop them off for long enough that the kelp forest can reestablish again. So you really have to do a really good job of it for it to actually work.
Questions?
What is the time frame, or perhaps like ideal versus realistic timeframes on these restoration projects?
Yeah, one of the things, that's a great question. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that time question. Because sometimes one of the questions we get is, well, why don't you just go ahead and let otters come back into the system and they'll kind of tidy things up, they'll take care of things. But something I don't think people realize is that otter reintroduction, if it happens, which it may still not happen, Fish and Wildlife Service is still considering whether or not to move that forward. would take probably 5 to 10 years before any otters were in the ground in Oregon, and it would probably take like 50 years before their populations were restored and at a healthy level if it succeeded. So reintroducing otters is definitely a long, like a long con, you know, it's the long game plan. So the strategies that we're working with right here are designed to work in the next 5 to 10 years before otter reintroduction happens and before we get we move into a system like what they have in Northern California. So based on experiments that have done elsewhere, urchin removal can work. Urchin removal and kelp urchin removal works best when it's paired with kelp enhancement and reseeding. And those can turn a kelp forest around in 2 to 5 years. So it's a much more immediate short-term way to try to restore some of these kelp forests. So if we had the funding that we needed to do all of this work really well, I would say there would be 5 or 6 different little kelp forests in Oregon within 5 years that would be in a much better place than they are today. But that's all funding dependent, so we'll see.
Thanks, Sarah. Great talk, and great to see you again. Question about a couple of questions. One on the socioeconomic side, and another one sort of more on the ecological side. You talked a little bit about the dulse and developing urchins and feeding them for but my understanding is that the purple urchins, which are the ones that have really undergone the population explosion in Oregon, they're not really much of a target species for the uni market. So I'm just wondering, are the socioeconomics there to make that a viable business? That's the first question. Second question. Okay. Is you showed some stuff from satellite images, and 40 years, that's or almost 40 years, that's a pretty good time period. But and it wasn't a consistent message for the Oregon things, but many species or others that are seen in the California current system undergo would have thought to be at least cyclic sort of things on much longer time scales than that. And so I guess it's a little bit of a speculatory question for you. What do you think about kelp? I mean, do you think that it's, up and down over, you think there are some longer? I mean, we don't know the mechanism. So just wondering thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, those are great questions, Greg. Thanks for those. The first one around the socioeconomics of purple urchins, Greg's totally right that historically red urchins, which are much bigger than purple urchins, have been the target for the urchin fishery because they're just bigger, better bang for your buck. You need to take fewer red urchins to get the same amount of uni. So that's historically been where the fishery is. However, I will note almost all of these things that we're doing, Oregon is not the first one to do them. We're taking notes from what other places have been doing. And so there have been efforts ongoing in Norway, British Columbia, California to create a purple urchin market. And so it's a little bit with a lot. And another thing is with a lot of aquaculture in the US, Americans don't like seafood that much, to be honest. When you look at us as a whole, we much rather eat beef and chicken and pork. We're a little squeamish around seafood, especially when it comes to shellfish. We're really squeamish around shellfish. And so I do think that for this to become like a major, like a real industry in Oregon, there needs to be more of the market development to get people, to get purple urchins into the uni pipeline, and then to expand interest in trying uni and eating uni. Most uni is exported to other, either really high-end sushi restaurants or to Japan. So that's, we're doing little bits around like trying to get people used to, trying to get people to taste uni and things like that. But there are other groups that have been at this for longer that are working on that market development. So you're totally right. That is something that needs to happen before this becomes a real economic consideration. Which, by the way, you can go out and crack urchins yourself and just eat the uni straight out of the urchin if you're ever interested in trying it. There are these thick, rich, kind of creamy, orange, yellow roe inside the urchin. Your second question was about long-term climate oscillations in the California current and what that means for Oregon's kelp forests. And those long-term climate oscillations, so for a lot of people are familiar with things like El Nino, which occurs on like a 3 to 7 year cycle, but there are things called like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, which can occur on more like decadal scales or even century timescales. And folks down in Southern California, where they have been monitoring kelp forests for 100 years, have shown that the macrocystis forests in California respond to those cycles. So I think those cycles certainly are at play here in Oregon. I think one thing that signals that this is something a little bit, there's something different going on right now is that one of the reasons I think we've been slow to jump on the topic of kelp forest restoration is that for decades, scientists have really considered kelp forests these really resilient dynamic systems. They're gone one year, they're back the next year, they're gone for a couple of years, and then they come back like, kind of like they always bounce back. And so for a long time, people were like, you know, we don't need to manage them. We don't need to restore them because they're just dynamic. It's what they do. I think there probably is an element of truth to that in Oregon's case as well. However, the fact that at this point, it's been 8 or 9 years in Northern California, and we just haven't seen meaningful recovery is beginning to really shake, I think, a lot of kelp forest scientists on the West Coast, that they're not bouncing back in that case. And I think that's what we're worried about here in Oregon. Is it possible that kelp forests could kind of recover on their own in 10, 15 years? I think it's possible. We're very worried about the alternative, which is because we become a Northern California-like system. And also some of the, you know, one of the reasons Orca first established was that urchin divers and commercial fishers in Port Orford are really worried about the loss of kelp forest habitat because it means the loss of fisheries for them. It means the urchin fishery closing. It has already meant the abalone fishery closing. It means those rockfish that their adult and their juvenile life stages depend on kelp. So I think there's a feeling in Port Orford and some of these other really fishery dependent communities that like we don't have 10 or 15 years to wait. At that point, the fishery could be collapsed. We may not have boats or permits anymore. So I think those are some of the reasons driving why we really feel like it's worth it to act now and not wait for, you know, the next phase in the climate oscillation. Yeah, thanks, Greg.
All right, please join me in thanking our speaker today.